their freedom to look to God to live. I want to bring in two experts now on George Whitefield. Thomas Kidd, Associate Professor of History at Baylor University and author of The Great Awakening. How are you, sir?
Good.
Have a seat. He is joined here by Jerome Mahaffey. How are you, sir?
It's fine.
Good. He is Associate Professor of Communications at Indiana University East and author of Preaching Politics, The Religious Rhetoric of George Whitefield and the Founding of a New Nation. Guys, first of all, neither of you thought, I'm going to do a national show on George Whitefield soon, right? Am I the first person to say? Yeah. He's totally erased from most people's history books. Now, most people have never heard of George Whitefield. How big of a role do you think he played?
Well, one of the things you have to start with Whitefield is that he was the best known person in colonial America, period.
How is that possible? That's like all of a sudden, I was going to say, actually, I could see this happening. That's like in 200 years, people saying, Michael Jackson, who? What? I mean, he was that big of a rock star, right?
Yes, he was. I mean, it's the equivalent of someone saying that, you know, they've never heard of Billy Graham or something like that,
right,
for us not to know about Whitefield. He was the primary instigator of the Great Awakening of the 18th century. He spoke to and was seen by far the most people in colonial America. And before the Revolution, he was simply the best known person in America.
Now, he actually, he had this weird ability to be able to speak in front of crowds outside, because nobody would let him preach in church. So he would speak out in crowds of sometimes 20,000 people, and everybody could hear him, and they said without screaming, right?
That's right. He was trained in the theater as a youth. He was a talented actor. And of course, they would develop your vocal projection and your ability to get your voice out there. But he also had this, a gifted voice. Sarah Edwards, Jonathan's wife, called it sweet. Ben Franklin called it like a beautiful piece of music. That's all they could compare his voice to. So he had this voice that people loved to listen to just for the sound of it, and he could extend it out to large groups of people.
Franklin actually walked the perimeter one time, right?
Well, Whitefield took a lot of criticism for overinflating the numbers in the newspapers. You know, they said, oh, 20,000 people, come on.
Right.
And so Franklin actually checked it out, because Franklin and Whitefield were very good friends. Among the major founders, Franklin is Whitefield's closest friend.
Okay.
And there was a time when Franklin went around in Philadelphia and marked out the boundaries and everything to see, is this true? Could 30,000 people, you know, or so really hear him at one time? And Franklin said, absolutely.
It's strange because we're told that Franklin is a godless heathen. And it's strange that he would become friends with a guy who was responsible for the Great Awakening. What did they, besides the fact that Franklin wasn't a godless heathen, what did they see in each other?
They probably saw a bit of each other in one another. They were both public figures. They were both celebrities, in a sense. And so they were both very involved in the printing industry. Of course, Franklin as a printer, Whitefield as the writer. And they did a lot of projects together early on. That's how they came to know each other. And in fact, they were close enough that Franklin wanted to move out to Ohio, the Ohio Territory, with Whitefield and start a new colony.
Right. I think that's amazing. I'd never read that before. Now, let me ask you this, because I can't imagine anybody saying this. They said that Whitefield was emotional and fake about it. They said that he was an entertainer. They said that he didn't believe any of this stuff. He was just doing it for money.
No, basically.
Why would they say that?
They feared him. Ben Franklin would have known a fake, I think.
Yeah.
And, maintained a fairly close relationship with him throughout Whitefield's life. Whitefield died before Franklin. And nobody ever really accused him of sounding fake, even his critics. That wasn't one of the problems they had with it. They were afraid of him and afraid of what he said.
I want to get into what he said here in a second, but let me go to this, because you said Franklin would have sensed a fraud. Tell the story. Which one of you guys knows the story about when Franklin came to listen to him and said, "I'm not giving this guy a dime"?
Well, Franklin, he came, as you said, to a meeting one time, and Whitefield, one of the reasons Whitefield was criticized is because he raised a lot of money for his orphanage in Georgia.
He was like the first televangelist without the telepart.
Right, and I think that's
Yeah.
actually, that kind of religious celebrity
Right.
is what he was about, and he raised enormous amounts of money for charity, especially for his orphanage. And Franklin and Whitefield had a funny relationship. I mean, if you ever get a chance to go back and look at Franklin's autobiography, he has a nice section in there about his relationship with Whitefield, and it's funny because they were different on religion. Even
Right.
though Franklin believed in God,
Yeah.
he believed in providence, but he was skeptical about traditional Christianity.
Right.
So they had, they kind of understood one another. And so Franklin went to one of his meetings, and he said, "I know he's going to ask for money, and I'm not giving anything." And Whitefield started speaking, and Franklin said, "Oh, I guess I'll give the coppers in my pocket." Next thing you know, he was given the silvers. And by the time the sermon was over, he had emptied the whole thing out, including the gold.
Right. Okay, now, this guy is the reason. This is the guy that really the Black Robe Brigade started. The preachers started talking about individual freedoms, and there probably wouldn't have been a revolution if it wasn't for this guy. There also wouldn't have been necessarily a deep personal relationship with God. And not only in just this country, but also in England as well. You need to meet this guy. Next. Tonight we're talking on Founders Fridays about George Whitefield, and there's plenty of stories that you can find. I promise you never learned in school. You'll find more stories in the Insider Extreme at glennbeck.com/extreme. You'll find more stories tonight on George Whitefield. Also this weekend, Insider Extreme is going to be streaming my speech at the NRA's annual conference. I'm giving that on Saturday. All the details at glennbeck.com. And I'm also giving the commencement address at Liberty University. Both of those will be carried live on Insider Extreme. Okay, back with Thomas Kidd and Jerome Mahaffey, and we're talking about George Whitefield, and I just want to set the scene a little bit. When he's young, he's over in England, and he's famous over in England first. He converts, he becomes a Methodist, but then he has kind of a really strange relationship, or strained relationship with most of the preachers. That comes from the preachers really being, Church of England. It was like, it was like having Barack Obama give your sermon all the time, I'd imagine, where it's the government, it's the government spin through the eyes of God. And they didn't really care about the poor because the poor didn't vote, right? Mm-hmm. And he was the first guy that says, wait a minute, guys, there are people out there cold and hungry. And that caused some real strain in England.
One of the issues that caused strain was that he would say about the ministers of the established churches that I don't think you really know what Christianity's all about. You've inherited your Christianity rather than chosen it as a belief.
He was the first guy that really kind of made popular the idea of born again, right?
He called it the new birth.
Right.
That's a term that was circulating then.
Right. And they didn't like it because they were all, I mean, look at the way they were dressed. They're all stuffy, and he gets emotional. And he's like, feel it.
Right.
Yeah.
Well, and of course, when he talks about the experience of being born again, this is something that Jesus had talked about, is that you'll never see the kingdom of heaven unless you're born again. And I think Whitefield understood that to be a heart-level relationship with God, that it's not just going to church, assenting to doctrine, but having a personal experience with God that affects your heart, not just your mind, because it's a relationship. And people, of course, got very emotional about this. I mean, and you said about the poor, I mean, he would go to the coal miners, for instance, and go and say, God loves you. God cares about you. I know nobody else cares about you, but God loves you.
And nobody said that. Back in those days, that was not done, right? When he went out to the coal mines, I read a story where he went out to the woods and nobody had seen. These are people that couldn't read, write. No, nobody. They were outcasts of society. And it took an immense amount of courage for him. He comes up on a hill and he just says, God loves you. And people stop and listen to him for a while, and a crowd gathers. They had never been preached to before, and they had, well, at least that way. He didn't use the rhetoric. He was speaking the common man's language.